All right, welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, friends. It is a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I hope you can hear me. I am always excited to be with you. It's nice to have a chance to meet over the years and continue to learn and study together. Um, I always say this, and I mean it. Spiritism has given me two great gifts. One is a new understanding of life, a new perspective about the world. And the second one, which I never expected, is the incredible amount of people, of friends that I've made throughout the world, really, that I would not otherwise have met were it not for Spiritism. So I'm twice blessed, so to speak, and it is a joy to be with you guys. I really enjoy being with you guys, and I'm honored to be here with you today. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's great to see familiar names and faces. I know that some to turn your cameras on if you want. Um, but thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time. And I hope you are keeping warm out there as things are starting to get cold. I don't have that problem right now because it's still a very chilly 68 degrees over here. But please know that I invite you virtually to the warmth of my office here and my heart as well. Today, the topic that we've chosen for our conversation is moral lessons from science, and sometimes I like to call it too, on the shoulder of giants, and that's from a beautiful quote from a scientist that said, "If today I can see farther than before, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants." And it's a beautiful way of looking at life in general because it is true that many of our accomplishments, many of our developments really have been built by those who have come before us. They have really laid a foundation and paved the way for us to be able to know what we know today and to live the way we live today. And at the same time, I think it's also interesting for us to acknowledge that we are living in very interesting times. I think all of us can can agree to that. The world is fundamentally different today than it was 1 year ago. I think that very few people, would have guessed that a year ago we would be finding ourselves under, a pandemic such as this one that has wreaked havoc in the entire world, and that is yet to go through its most difficult phase, which is coming up now. And throughout this whole process, we have heard debates and challenges and confusion and fights, really, about the role of science and the role of religion in all of this. And what is interesting to me is that somehow, somewhere in there in our minds, we have made this collective assumption that science and religion or ethics are in two different sides of the spectrum, that they are two things that are opposed to each other. Yet, I think that when we employ a more holistic perspective, we are going to find out that both of them are really connected at the hip, so to speak, because both of them seek new information and seek ways in finding a means in which we can live a better and happier life. They just go about it in different ways. So what we're hoping to do today is to try to cast a wider net and see if there are lessons, if there are ethical lessons that we can arrive at from scientific achievements. And I think that you'll be surprised when we start to cast our spiritist eyes and try to bring these things together, that we're going to find out that they're manifestations of the same divine drive to push us forward and to help us grow. And so what we are hoping to do today is to spend some time talking about 5 different scientists and their achievements and how that relates to our world today in an ethical and manner, if that makes sense. Sorry. And so what we hope to do is go through those cases, see if we can arrive at some meaning, and then perhaps, if we have time, open a conversation, or at least leave some material for us to self-reflect about our role in the universe and the ethical implications of these discoveries that have taken place a while back, but nevertheless are still very meaningful to us today. Maybe you know all these scientists. Maybe you know a couple of them. Maybe you know none of them. That's not important. What important is, what is it that we are going to take away from their work, and how do we apply that to our lives? At the end of the day, whatever it is that we do, it's only as meaningful as we make it. So let's go and jump into it. Does that make sense? And we hope to make time in the end for interactions, if that's okay. I love interacting with you guys. I am going to try not to babble for too long. Sometimes I can't resist myself, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try to make time for us, so that we can have a chat and a conversation at the end. And let's dive in. All right. So on the shoulders of giants, let's go ahead and do this. First, I want to talk about something that I think is fascinating that we have learned through the Spirit's book. And that is this idea of moral progress. I think that we, within the Spiritist realm, oftentimes agree that what is most important for us is for us to develop ourselves as human beings, as spirits, right? To know how to become better people. However, the question of how to do that is a fleeting one. It's sometimes very hard for us to find out, how do we get there, right? I think we all agree we want to be better people. But I find that many times we're lost on the way. We are hard-pressed to know what are the steps and what are the things that go into becoming a better person. And what I found fascinating is this question over here from the Spirit's book, when Allan Kardec asked the higher spirits, does moral progress always follow intellectual progress? And here's an interesting perspective, because what he's really asking is if becoming a better person comes after we acquire intellectual progress, right? So is there a relationship between moral progress and intellectual progress? And what is that relationship? I think is at the core of this question. And so as he does that, the spirits answer very wisely. They say, oops, probably would help if I click the right buttons, right? All right. They say it is its consequence, but it does not always follow immediately. So we have a relationship established here between moral progress and intellectual progress. What the spirits are telling us is that moral progress always comes after intellectual progress, but it doesn't come immediately after. The immediacy of it, how fast it happens, depends on a series of factors, including our ability to implement things. And this is a fascinating thing, because sometimes I feel like we make this assumption that moral progress and moral development is something separate than intellectual development. And I think sometimes we even cast a bad eye towards intellectual development, saying, that's not as important. Right? What's important is to become a better person. However, what the spirits are telling us here is that you cannot become a better person if you don't exercise your intellect. And what do I mean by that? If we learn, right? So unless we learn new things, we are not going to be able to grow in ethically and morally, because we need to understand things and we need to think about the world to see how is it that we are going to act on the world and how are we going to behave in the world. So it's very important for us to constantly try to stretch our intellectual muscles to better be able to have that which is inside ourselves to become better people. It's only after we learn something new that we can apply it, right? And we need to constantly learn new things to apply it to the world, to make this world a better place. So I think it's fascinating because it draws an interesting connection between intellectual progress and application of said progress. And in a way, I sort of make a parallel saying it draws a parallel between science and our learning in general and how it can make the world a better place. So this is our starting point for us to think about things. And I think that we can relate to that a little bit and see that this world is a little bit lopsided. I bring here a question from a quote from a poet that I like, that in an essay he wrote, "Where is all the wisdom information brought us?" Right? And I think that's exactly what we're getting at, which is we have arrived at a time and space where our society has developed greatly intellectually, but we have not yet made use of all the intellectual developments that we have had to apply it successfully to make it the better world for everyone. So there is the acquiring knowledge and there's the application of knowledge, right? For a comfort and for a betterment. Our job as human beings, and especially at this point in time, is to try to pay particular emphasis in bringing these two things together, to leverage that which we have already learned and see how we can act on the world. And I think that one of the places that we can look at is to science, because we write science off at times, saying that's only going to give us intellectual knowledge. But if we look more carefully, I posit that we are going to take great ethical implications from that as well. So let's dive into that. My mouse is not liking me today. Let's see if that's going to work. Okay. All right. So, all right. One other interesting thing that we also find fascinating in Spiritism is something else that makes the topic really, really great. In the Spiritist Review of 1864, Kardec writes this idea, which I think is a fascinating and beautiful one, very poetic. He talks about the universal control of the spirits. And what is the universal control of the spirits? It's this idea that if something is true and it comes from God, then we are going to see it manifested in many different places and in many different ways, because God would never choose some people over another. So it's also incumbent upon us to see if the things that we are learning are reflected elsewhere, because if we find them elsewhere, it is also a greater proof, or it's a greater confirmation that we are not being led astray by our own mind and our intellect. So when millions of people see and hear the same thing, it is a guarantee to us, to all of us, that that thing really is what it is. So as we look to science and draw ethical implications from science, we are assured that those ethical implications that we see elsewhere are also legit, for lack of a better word, right? So as we're going through this and we're revisiting things, it's really great to see this divine message reflected in many different places. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know. All right, so let's dive into this, right? All right, so 5 different people. Let's start. Here, it's important for us to talk about what science is too, right? So the definition of science here is that intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic or organized study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. It's also sometimes used to denote a particular area of science, and also can be understood as a systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. So what science really is a intentional and structured way of trying to understand the world around us. So let's demystify the word a little bit so that we can understand that in many different ways, we are practicing science when we study, when we have a structured way of going about things and trying to make sense of the behavior of the physical and natural world through our observations and experimentation. And when we put that within that frame, we might be able to break away this idea that we think that science is just test tubes, right? And computers and numbers. It is really an approach to things. So that's why I think it's so interesting for us to connect the dots, because in many different ways, that's exactly what Spiritism proposes to do, right? All right. Now that we've taken care of that, let's dive into what's really interesting here. So the first person that we want to start with today is this lovely fellow there. And his name is, you guessed it, Nikolaus Copernicus. And Copernicus, with all the luscious set of hair that makes me really jealous, look at that. Just looks like he has been using the best shampoos out there. He was a Polish mathematician and astronomer who lived in the 15th and 16th century. So he was born in 1473 and passed away in 1543. And what's really fascinating about Copernicus is that he finally brought us through facts and observation the heliocentric view of the cosmos. And what does that mean? Helio means the sun, and centric in the middle. So until Copernicus, we didn't really accept that the sun was at the center of our immediate universe. Until the 1500s, we really considered that everything around the universe that we see at night, all the stars, rotated around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of the cosmos. Let that sink in for a second, my friends. In the thousands and thousands of years of human history and prehistory, we always thought that everything that our eyes saw in the world outside, the clouds, the stars, the sun, the moons, that all of it rotated around us. Now, it is true that earlier thinkers had posited that that was the case, but by and large, they had been ignored, and we did not really have a lot of facts to finally validate this. But with Copernicus, we make this incredible journey, and we begin to realize that the planet that we sit in, that this reality that we sit in, is not the center of the universe. And that is a fascinating piece because it really makes us ask the question, how does that relate to our psychological makeup? So as a society, we have made a leap, scientifically speaking, to accepting that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the Earth revolves around the sun, and that we go into this beautiful dance with all the different planets that revolve around the sun. And later we are to find out that the sun too revolves around other systems, and that together we are in an even greater dance through the universe within our own galaxy, which also makes its way and movement through the cosmos along with other galaxies. It's an incredible, beautiful system that really tells us that although we are very important and very grateful to be here, we're not the center of the universe. And so how does that translate? How does that translate to our day-to-day lives? How does that translate to our actions? Do we live in a pre-Copernican psychological state of mind? Do we still think that everything in the world is out to get us or is there for us? Do we still think that we are the brightest spot in the universe and that everything that ever happens for us or against us? Are we still thinking that we are the ruler upon which we measure all things? And it's a really important piece for us to understand that, having ourselves own psychological universe can be and a painful one, because if everything is just against or for us, things get really personal, and then we get really sad and really hurt sometimes because we think that everybody's out to get us. So when things don't happen a certain way, it's because people don't like us. But that's not the case. People are going about their daily lives. People are going about their challenges, their tribulations, and they're just trying to be the best version of themselves. And in the process, sometimes they might bump against us. So when we begin to understand that we are not the brightest spot, when we make this Copernican revolution, we begin to see that we have to let go of this idea and this tendency that we are the center of the universe. And we see that reflected, interestingly, in question 913 of the Spirits book, when the good spirits tells us that selfishness is the root of all vices. That as long as we continue to care about ourselves first in detriment of everybody else, then we are going to develop a series of vices that are not going to help us move forward emotionally and spiritually. And I think I want to make a distinction here too, that I think some of you might have followed me on my last talk. I want to make a distinction between selfishness and self-centeredness, right? Self-centeredness, for me, is when you're doing things like ignoring that there are other people out there. You are self-centered. Selfishness is when you do things, even if it hurts other people. right? So I think that being self-centered is already an achievement over being selfish. Nevertheless, the call for the moment here from Copernicus is for us to think outside our own belly buttons, is to consider other people and understand that we are not the center of the universe. And I think that is an interesting perspective for us right now in a day and age when a lot of people are saying, I don't want to behave a certain way because it's inconvenient for me, not knowing that their behaviors and their attitudes might affect other people. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and you see some people who are very careless about how they are carrying themselves out there. And even if they don't believe in the power of science, it would still be a considered thing to be mindful of others, right? So there is an interesting lesson for us to take from here, which is to really consider the fact that there are other people out there. And we need to start thinking about how is it that we are going to live with other people, understanding that they too are going about their world. So I think the invitation Copernicus leaves us is that of personal transformation, of this incredible mind shift from thinking just about us in detriment of other people to considering that there are other people in the universe. Does it make sense? So I think that's the message that Copernicus brings us today. Now, to make sure that we have enough time, we're going to move forward. And let's talk about this other young, handsome fella with also a very beautiful head of hair on his shoulders. As you get older and you lose hair, you start to notice these things more often. And here he goes. And his name, as you may have as well guessed, is Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton, an English mathematician on the 17th and 18th centuries there. So he was born in 1643 and passed away in 1727. We have done a good jump here, as you noticed in terms of history. And by the way, our folks today are lined up chronologically just because they don't need to be, but I decided that makes sense in my head. And I think we all have heard of Sir Isaac Newton in our different lessons in our physics classes if we have had them. And he is very famous for many different things. But one of the incredible achievements and gifts that he has given us is this concept of these three different laws of motion. And in Newton's third law of motion, he tells us that to every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. As he studies different forces out there, he noticed that every time that a specific physical force is applied upon something, that force will be met with an opposition on the other side. And I think that is a really great way of looking in life, because when we make that Copernican leap, we begin to interact with the world in a different way, and we understand that it's only natural that everything that we do will have an impact in the world. And that impact might be that the world pushes back at us too. So it's important to know this because it helps us be prepared for the consequence of our actions. We shouldn't just expect that everything that we do is going to happen the way we want to. We should not just expect that we are going to be able to make the world the way we would like it to be. We should expect that we are going to be met with resistance. That is the law of nature. And when that happens, we need not be discouraged because that's how things are. We should expect this resistance. And in that manner, we should also be very mindful of what is it that we are doing unto the world, because it will have a consequence. And we are led then to start thinking, how do my actions influence the world? And how are the consequences of my current life the result of the forces that I have put out there? Because what his teachings tells us between us and the world, right? So every time that we do something, something else will happen. And so it's important for us to internalize this, because oftentimes we find that our lives are hard, our lives are difficult, and that is true. But at the same time, it's meant to be this way, because this is where we are honing our perspectives. This is where we are learning new things, and there are consequences to our choices. And so when we see those consequences to our choices, whether we remember them from this life or whether we don't know where they come from, or which is from previous lives, whatever it is that we are facing is a direct consequence of our past actions. And so that's just a law of nature. And that law of nature is also a spiritual law, because nature is part of the spiritual world. So when we think about this, it becomes interesting for us to really begin to understand cause and effect as it pertains to our actions. And it leads us to think, or should lead us to think, proactively think about how our actions will impact the world around us. And for us, who like to study this Spiritist science, so to speak, this body of knowledge that also continues to grab information, if we like to understand more and see that firsthand, one great place to go to is the book Heaven and Hell, chapter 7. And there you find 33 different items that talk about cause and effect. And if you're not familiar with the book Heaven and Hell, it's a wonderful book that sometimes is not really widely read within the Spiritist circles. It's divided in two parts. The first part, I call it, scenes from a previous episode. It's basically a summation of Spiritism and some of its beliefs, in case you have not yet read the Spirit's book and the books that come before. And part two are communications from the spirit world, where we have a chance to read from spirits in firsthand how they live their lives while on earth and how they are facing the consequences of their actions in the spiritual realm. So they tell us if they're happy, if they're unhappy. They tell us about what they got right. They tell us what they got wrong. I sometimes call it a Spiritist soap opera, because you get to hear the stories firsthand. There's quite a bit of drama and success in there. But it's a interesting book. And if you want to get just to the cases and read firsthand and how that worked, you can go ahead and jump to part 2 and read the communications. But nevertheless, our point here, which we hope is backed by the idea behind Newton's 3 laws of motion, is that we must be mindful of the actions that we put out into the world, because they would yield opposite reactions. So when we are acting upon the world, are we thinking about the consequences of our actions? When we are going about our days and making our choices, are we proactively considering how that might affect ourselves and others? That is the question for the times. And I think that's the Newtonian legacy that we have to face and consider, is that we are going to have a sizable impact in the world. That's a beautiful thing, but with it comes great power comes great responsibilities, right? So that's, I think, what Newton whispers to us through the times. And that is a second perspective here, a second lesson, I think, ethically, that we can take from the beautiful science of Isaac Newton. Are you with me so far? Okay, my goal is to make sure that at least one of you guys sleep to the end of the day. So I'm doing my best. Hang in there. All right, number 3. First, you might start noticing that the amount of hair has greatly subsidized all of a sudden. Look at that. We no longer have that luscious set of hair, which is really good for me. But this guy here, this young fellow, you might recognize from pictures, is Charles Darwin. And he was an English naturalist, born in 1809, so 19th century, and passed away in 1882 by Kardec's time, right? So what's interesting about Charles Darwin, I think that perhaps this is one of the most mainstream scientists, at least his science has been talked about for the past decades, as it pertains to this great, this seemingly opposition between science and religion, right? And origin of the species. This idea that forms, like all animals, evolve with time, and that their evolution through the physical world is a result of their adaptation. So, you have different species of the same animal, and that species that will survive and thrive is the one that's able to adapt to the environment more often. And his studies, we see that. He tells us, for instance, about there were some butterflies and some moths that were darker. And during the industrial age, with a lot of coal out in the atmosphere, things got darker, and the brighter and shinier moth and butterflies didn't thrive as much because they stood out against the dark background of trees and therefore were eaten by the predators. However, those who were darker and blended in more with their surroundings thrived more and were able to continue to exist because they blended into their surroundings. So the idea that those who adapt to their environment are those who are going to continue to evolve. It's a beautiful one in many different ways. I think there's many lessons that we can take from Darwin. And what he also tells us, interestingly enough, is that if we think about it this way, he said maybe we can also arrive at the idea of a common ancestor, right? Like maybe we can all go back, all different animal species could go back to just one form, one animal, one cell, what have you, that from which everything else originated. And I think that's a very poetic idea, because in a different way, I think that indirect, with some poetic license, we're talking about all of us coming from the same source, from God in general. And that's a beautiful thing. And we know that this theory, right, of the evolution of the species is something that has been in the folks who think and believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible. And they think that this is sometimes an affront to their view of the world, whereas some other people, like myself, think that it's actually a more beautiful example of how divinity works. I think that's an even more beautiful world, one in which we see that creation is currently and constantly evolving into something greater and more beautiful. But nevertheless, what's really great here is that Charles Darwin's theory of the evolution of the species really matches our understanding of the evolution of the world as well, not just the physical world, but also the spiritual world. In the Spirit's book, question 540, there's many different things in there. At the end of that question, we have the elevated spirits, the enlightened spirits, telling us something powerful, incredible. There's a beautiful sentence, and says that everything in nature is connected, from the most primitive atom to the most beautiful angel, right? Which itself was at one point an atom. So we see here that the spirits are telling us that there is a constant evolution, not only in the physical world, but also in the spiritual realm, that everything is in constant adaptation and growth. And when we take that to heart, I think that this lesson is a transformative one, friends, because it really changes, or has the ability to change, our mindsets about the world, about ourselves, and about our neighbors. Because if everything is constantly evolving, then we are different today than we were yesterday, which means we could be perhaps a little bit more tolerant upon ourselves and our old selves and the mistakes that we've made in the past. Because sometimes we are our greatest critics. And it is true that the more we look into the past, the more likely we are to see things that are not so great. Because if everything is constantly evolving, then the more you look back, you're going to see a less flattering version of you, because you knew less, right? So that's great in many different ways, because it should tells us to be a little bit more gracious and grateful with ourselves, to give ourselves some slack, so to say, and let us, be at ease with the fact that now we know better, we can do better. But at the same time, this also raises another important implication. Think about here, right? If we bring Copernicus back into the mix, we should say, hey, the same applies to other people. We could also start to practice the idea that everyone around us is also in constant evolution. So what they have done in the past and who they were in the past is not necessarily who they are now. And that they're also deserving of our tolerance and our acceptance, because they too are evolving. And much like us, they are just trying the best way they can to be happy. So, how does that change human relations? How does that change our posture towards other people? How does that affect our view of the world? Are we able to take a step back when we find ourselves in difficult situations to think, wait a minute, I'm not going to take things personally. Everybody's constantly evolving. Let me try to give some folks over there some grace. Let me try to understand what they're trying to do, as opposed to just taking it personally. Are we giving yourselves space to let these beautiful lessons that we have learned over time really sink in and take hold in our hearts for us to be more tolerant with ourselves and others? And I think that's one of the great lessons that Charles Darwin leaves us. Grace towards ourselves and grace towards others, and the certainty that we're constantly evolving. All right. And if that has not put you to sleep just yet, let's move on to the next one. This young fellow over here, and notice the thinning hairline, which makes me feel smarter by the minute, is someone who's perhaps not really well known in traditional mainstream circles, but who nevertheless has been fascinating. His name is James Clerk Maxwell, and he was a Scottish mathematician born in 1831 to 1879, so 19th century. And what Maxwell did was something very fascinating. He created the unified model of electromagnetism. What that is to say, he was able to leverage math and put into mathematical equations a lot of the work that has been done, for instance, by Faraday before. And what he did was to be able to demonstrate with us that there is a relationship, mathematically speaking, between electricity and magnetism. That, in fact, they were related in such a way that we could then transform our understanding of the world, that the light was an electromagnetic wave. Because when we have a current of electricity, we have a magnetic field. And he was able to demonstrate that mathematically. And this sounds really convoluted, perhaps, for those of us that might not be inclined to math and engineering in general. But the consequences of this are fascinating. Think here with me. For the first time in our history, we have proved mathematically that there are invisible forces, magnetism, that we cannot see, that affect our world. That is powerful, because that is a big leap with I only believe what my eyes can see. Well, magnetism cannot be seen always by our eyes. We can only see the effects of it. Nevertheless, it is there, and we can predict it, and we understand how it works. As a matter of fact, we have remote controls, right? They are electromagnetic devices. All the things that we're working, like computers are electromagnetic devices. All these things, all this knowledge was made possible by these set of equations that have allowed us to move forward and gain so much knowledge. And that's because there are invisible forces acting upon the world that we know of and that we can quantify, predict, and even harness to our own advantage. It's a sizable scientific achievement that we don't often think about because we don't see it. We see its consequences. But you can say, Dan, what are the implications of that? Well, the implications of that is that there are invisible forces acting upon us every single day, which is not different than what we learn in the Spirit's book in question number 459, when Kardec asked the good spirits if the spirits actually have an influence in our daily physical lives. And you might remember the answer if you have read this before, because sometimes it shocks people. The good spirits actually tell us that they influence our thoughts and actions more than we imagine. Sometimes it's through intuition. Sometimes it is through what I call spiritual bullying. But the influence of the spirits, the influence of minds, it's an important and powerful one, because we too are influencing each other. Our thoughts, our behavior, our energy influences each other. And that is really an incredible awareness, because it leads us to start to question, what is it that is guiding me, my thoughts? And how is the outside world, be it physical or spiritual, how is that world influencing me? And how can I even know what's influencing me if I don't know myself? So it is a very impactful set of questions, because it leads us to the reflection about who we are and how we act in the world and what guides us to act in the world. It builds upon all the things that we were talking about. But it is an interesting question, because if we go about our lives without really making time to reflect upon what is guiding us and what are the principles and whether they're external and internal to ourselves, it might be hard for us to fully leverage all our talents and abilities. So Maxwell's invitation for us is to consider that there are indeed invisible forces that act upon us, and that we should put some time and effort into trying to understand them, so that we may also understand what forces are acting upon us and how we can either prevent the negative influence or leverage their positive influence to build upon the world. And so, are we making time to reflect? Are we making time to think about the invisible forces that act upon us? Whether they be spiritual, whether they be emotional, we need time to reflect. And I think that's what James Clerk Maxwell leaves us as a great legacy in general. All right. I know there's quite a bit of content. We could probably break this into different talks and different things and have a conversation about it, but let's move on to the next one. And this man might be very famous as well in scientific circles. And notice that there's no hair there. So, I am getting closer and closer to a scientific look myself, as you can tell. And this one over here is Sigmund Freud. And although I'm not necessarily the most, the biggest fan of Freud's work in general, I think it's very important nevertheless. And he's an Austrian psychiatrist that was born in 1856 to 1939, so very recent in our history. And what's fascinating about it is he's the father of psychoanalytic school of psychology, to us about the unconscious mind. Have a set of luggage, so to speak, that we are not conscious of within ourselves. And of course, there are other people who are also doing amazing studies and developing the field of psychology and psychiatrist, like William Wundt and William James and Carl Jung as well, that came later with the idea of individuation, which is very spiritual in many different ways. And it's all very interesting, and I think their work also needs to be recognized and explored. But what's fascinating about Freud and this time period in general is that, think with me here in this. This is I find this very impactful. It was only in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, that we really started to turn our mind's eye inwards and start to develop a science that really speaks to understanding how we work mentally, how we behave, and how can we deal with the challenges of our own behavior and our own thoughts. And that's really important, because in thousands of years of history, we haven't paid as much attention to how we tick mentally. And it's no surprise that nowadays we still have a big stigma with mental illnesses in general, because we have not been used to turning our minds internally and asking how we are doing, how we're behaving, and what is it that we can really do to have a healthier relationship with ourselves and the world around us. In many ways, our coaches of the mind, they help us walk through our own luggage and untangle the trauma that we've had and make sense of the world, and can be a very helpful partner in helping us sort things out. And that is something that's relatively young as a specialized field of study. And I think it's fascinating because it shows us that we have just been here for a short period of time as a society, that we need more introspection, that we need to go deeper into ourselves and reflect and understand how our minds are working together or against our feelings and hearts in general. So this internal journey, it's a beautiful one that is highlighted by a very important question in the Spirit's book as well. Question 919, when Kardec asks, what is one of the best ways for us to develop individually, moral, spiritually? And the good spirits answer, do like a sage in antiquity has told you, know yourself. And that means we must spend time thinking about ourselves, not in a selfish way, but just trying to understand what are our motivations, why we act the way we do. Why do we make the choices that we do? And like we said before, be okay with it. Just trying to understand who we are and what is it that we need, because our behavior is a result of needs. We behave a certain way because we are consciously or unconsciously needing something or wanting something, and therefore we act towards it. So as we begin to ask the questions, what are my needs? We can also ask the questions of other people's behavior and try to understand where they're coming from and why they're acting a specific way. And when we begin to think of others as people who are also working towards their own happiness, trying to fulfill their own needs, we begin to have greater insight about why they act that way and becomes less personal. It becomes easier to understand the world and know that we're in constant evolution. So it's a great moment of awareness, a great moment of growth when we begin to understand that we behave specific ways because they are conscious or unconscious needs that we have been trying to meet for ourselves. And that makes us more tolerant of ourselves and others too, like we said before. It's a great piece of knowledge, a great advice to dive deeper into ourselves, to try to understand what are our motivations, why we do things this way. And I think that's the invitation that Freud and James and Wundt and Jung and psychology in general leave for us. Are we looking enough inwards? Are we thinking what makes us tick? What makes us go? What is it that we want? I think we need to reflect that. I think we need to know ourselves a little bit more. All right. So we've walked through our different lessons for the day. We learned with Copernicus that it's important for us to step outside this idea that we are the center of the universe and consider that people around us, and that we should be mindful of that. We visited Newton and also learned that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, that we are to expect that all our actions will have consequence and will have an impact into the world. And that we should also expect that we will feel opposition to things that we do. And that is the world. The world will push back on us because that's how we learn. It is a natural law, and that is okay. But when we know it, when we know that it will become easier to deal with it. We also visited with Charles Darwin and considered that it is not only the physical world that is constantly evolving, but it's also the spiritual world, that we are constantly evolving because we are part of both the physical and the spiritual worlds. So if that is the case, have we been able to give ourselves some grace with whom we were yesterday? Are we able to be more tolerant of others in general because they are also evolving? And in the process of evolution, we also spent a brief time with Maxwell, in which we learned one more time that we already have the scientific knowledge to understand that there are invisible forces acting upon us that can be measured and that can be felt. The same is true from the spiritual world as well. It's important for us to understand that there are spiritual forces acting upon the world and that we should think about that. Last but not least, we also spent a minute with Freud to consider that this time, even if it has taken us a while to get here, to shift our focus inward and ask ourselves important questions as to why is it that we behave the way we do? What kind of needs are we trying to meet? What are the things that we can take away from that? And what do we want for ourselves moving forward? So in many different ways, bringing these people together and trying to bridge the gap between science and religion, or science and ethical implications. It's a great exercise for us to see that there is indeed a greater force acting upon the world. There is a God behind all of this, behind all of us, and is showing us and is leaving us some breadcrumbs to tell us that there is a direct relationship between the physical world and the spiritual reality, and that everything is connected. And that's one of the beautiful things I think about Spiritism, is because it helps us see, as a science, as a way of studying the physical and the spiritual world, and ask ourselves important questions like, what are we? Where do we come from? And what is our final destination? What are we going to evolve to as immortal spirits that we are? And what is this relationship between the spiritual and the physical world? So I think that one of the most fascinating things that Spiritism brings us is the connection, is this invitation for us to look beyond just the physical realm or just the spiritual realm as separate and different from each other. They are one and the same, self-superimposed. And that we would do well to see that God is acting everywhere at all times. And that we see these laws reflected not only in the physical world, but they also have ethical implications for our own living. So it's important for us to continue to try to push outside of boundaries, to push outside of comfort zones, to try to understand different things that perhaps are not as insightful or as exciting for us. Maybe we're not so keen to learn about Maxwell's achievements, but nevertheless, he brings us some insights that we can take into our own lives. So the invitation that stands today with us is, how can we stretch ourselves? How can we stretch ourselves outside of our comfort zone to learn more about the world, and then take that new knowledge in and see how we can apply this to our own daily lives? Because we do stand in the shoulder of giants. We are able to see things farther than our ancestors have done before, in part because of their great work. So let's honor that great tradition of moral progress that God has built within our hearts to always go forward, and do it in a way that brings everything together. This world is full of division, my friends. This world is full of conflict. This world is full of polarized intentions. And there are tons of people that want you to tell you and want to profit from the idea that there are always things battling each other. And as we learn here, things actually converge. We can see science and religion coming together, and so must we. We must also come together as immortal spirits that we are. We must come together first by healing ourselves and looking into ourselves, but also stretching a hand out to those immediately around us and making a difference into the world. Because we know with time and space, at our mercy, we are going to come back as many times as we need to. And now that we are aware of the spirituality in general and the spiritual lessons that continue to be echoed through the times for us, we know better. We know different things together, and that we're all working under the banner of one larger creator that takes care of us. And if there are many lessons to take away from this, is that we are going to continue to evolve just like science has too. And so give ourselves some grace. Give some grace for those around you as well. To be more tolerant in a world that needs it so desperately. Let's exercise our spiritual hats, now structured by some scientific foundations, to be that different and to make progress not only physically, but also spiritually. And I hope that is the message that stays with us, that Spiritism is always forward-facing, even when we look back to try to understand ourselves. We have a lot to look forward to in the future. So hope in our hearts and certainty that everything is going to be okay.